The human capital model and the role of education policies. Within this box, we're going to put together a diagram that explains the human capital model and how education policies fit into that model. Let's start with the household and the education system. We'll be looking at the relationship between these two. Households take important decisions to invest in the education of their younger members. Investment decisions are influenced by several factors. The household sees, perhaps inaccurately, what incomes are associated with specific years of schooling and qualifications. If you invest in 7 years of education, you get X income. If you invest in 8 years, you get a bit more, and so on. And the household sees the direct costs of education, such as school fees and the cost of traveling to the school or university. These costs, if too high, may discourage the household from investing in more education. The household's idea of what people earn influences its understanding of the indirect cost or opportunity cost of an extra year of education. The opportunity cost is the income you do not earn because you're spending your time studying instead. If you are already quite educated and you could earn a high income, it would probably be a bad idea to continue educating yourself even if you liked studying. The opportunity cost would be too high. Now, when the household considers altogether the expected income from particular years of education, the opportunity costs, and the direct costs, then what the household is doing, though it may not think it's doing this, is calculating the private rates of return to education. So rates of return calculations take into account both the costs and benefits of education and tell the household whether it's worth investing further in education. Economists spend a lot of time trying to make these rates of return explicit. Now, let us turn to the education system. Essentially, education systems produce two things. They produce what a lot of education people call learning outcomes, and economists like to call cognitive skills. Education teaches you to understand new things. On the other hand, education systems give people qualifications, extremely important pieces of paper which we can think of almost as money, as currency. As most people have realized, qualifications do not give an entirely accurate picture of what learning outcomes a student has achieved. Two people with the same qualification can have very different sets of skills for many reasons. One extremely important factor here is home background. The kind of household we come from influences our skills and our ability to learn within the education system to a very large degree. The key thing economists have realized through many studies is the level of education of the parents and other people in the household. The more educated your parents and elder brothers and sisters are, the better you perform in the education system on average. Of course, there are many exceptions. Children of poorly educated parents who perform well and children of well-educated parents who perform poorly. But we're concerned with averages here. Learning outcomes or skills is what makes us more productive. This is what human capital is all about. It's about the abilities of people, mental abilities, social abilities, language abilities, abilities with respect to specific technologies such as computers, and physical abilities, from the ability to carry a baby properly to the ability to swim. The stronger our abilities, the better we can communicate with others when we work, the better we are at solving problems, the better we are at using machines or even inventing new ones. What do qualifications do for us? Well, qualifications represent human capital, often rather imperfectly. Yet, qualifications are vital for signaling our abilities to people, such as employers, who do not have the intimate knowledge about ourselves. Employers use qualifications for something economists call screening. This means they look at qualifications to see who the strongest candidates are for the job. Armed with human capital and qualifications, we obtain jobs and we earn an income. In general, the better our qualifications and abilities, the better our incomes. Again, there are of course many exceptions, but we're interested in averages here. Roughly speaking, all our incomes added up equal GDP, or the economy of the country. If our levels of education are improving from one generation to the next, partly because of the transfer across generations in the household, then the total income of the country will increase, and we say we have economic growth. Of course, there are factors other than human capital that lead to economic growth, for instance, the discovery of a natural resource such as oil. But even under these circumstances, growth in the human capital of the country will assist in a more efficient utilization of the natural resources. A big issue in economic growth theory and in the human capital model is the contribution made by positive externalities to growth and social development. Positive externalities are basically positive effects that were not intended. When households invest in education, they're thinking about the benefits just in terms of additional income earned. But economic growth is more than just the sum of income benefits enjoyed by thousands of individual households. When a population is more educated, many things work better in that society, from the trust between citizens to the rule of law. This improves productivity and therefore people's incomes even further. People have to spend less time trying to work out whom they can trust, for instance. Contracts are drawn up faster and maybe simpler. People can get on with their work. These powerful forces are our positive externalities. Now, to close the circle, we see that the incomes inform households of what opportunities exist in the economy and what the value of education is in the workplace. Note that we have a cycle that works across generations. The human capital of the next generation is improved, meaning there can be more educational support in the home for the subsequent generation. There is more income, allowing households to deal with the direct and indirect costs of more education and so on. What we've looked at up till now is a standard human capital model based on the work of economists like Schultz and Mincer. Now, let's turn to matters that are more directly related to education policies. What we would like to understand is how government's policies can improve the workings of the human capital model. How can governments, and specifically education policymakers, speed up the process, ensure that the jump in human capital from one generation to the next is as large as possible so the country achieves its growth and development potential? Let's start by inserting the key levels of the education system: primary, secondary, higher or post-school. For now, we'll ignore subsectors such as preschool and vocational training for the sake of simplicity. First, the crucial matter of public spending. Nowadays, it's taken as a given that any government should fund primary schooling. However, if one looks carefully at the human capital model, then it should become clear that it is the poor who need publicly funded primary schooling. It's poor households which are likely to find direct education costs excessive. Keep in mind that what government funding does is that it shifts the direct costs from the household to the state. The rich, according to the model, would send all their children to school even without government assistance because it's a good investment. However, we find that in many countries, governments will use tax revenue to fund primary schooling for everyone, both the rich and the poor. There are many reasons why governments may fund the schooling of the rich. For instance, it may be seen as important for social unity to educate all children in public schools and to limit the size of the private school sector. At the tertiary level, where costs per student are higher, the economic argument for public funding is actually not as strong as at the primary level. Because the income returns to having tertiary education are generally quite good, in theory at least, banks should be very willing to provide loans to students whose families cannot afford the full cost of a university education. Banks know that most university graduates will be able to pay back their loans with interest. However, this is in theory. In practice, in many developing countries, banking and loan systems in the private sector are not mature, and it becomes necessary for the government to step in with grants and loans. To sum up, public spending is one way a government can accelerate human capital accumulation. But even with government funding, some households may decide that the opportunity costs of education are too high and therefore keep their children out of school. It may be more profitable to have the children working on the family farm or going out for employment as child labor. To prevent this, most governments force all households to invest in at least some years of education for every child. Generally, we call this compulsory schooling. But we could also think of it as forced investment. Here, a critical question is up till what point in the education system you want to make schooling compulsory. If you make compulsory schooling too long, given the kind of economy you have, this may be bad for the economy. A government could end up restricting economic growth by having too many people studying and too few people producing. The question of when to make lower secondary and then upper secondary schooling compulsory is a difficult one. The very public nature of the education system in most countries creates situations of monopsony and monopoly, which can result in prices that are too high or even too low relative to what they should be. A monopoly is something you've probably heard of. This is found where there's just one supplier of a product. For instance, Microsoft for many years. In schooling systems, we often have teacher monopolies in the sense that one teacher union negotiates on behalf of all teachers when the salaries or prices of teachers are set. A monopsony, on the other hand, is a situation where there is just one buyer. When it comes to things required by the schooling system, such as teachers and school textbooks, there's often just one big buyer, the state. All these dynamics complicate the setting of prices enormously. One thing a government must thus do is to manage prices in the education sector well, for instance through informed and skillful negotiation with unions and by ensuring that government practices do not contribute towards overpriced schoolbooks. One fairly radical solution is to make prices more market-oriented, for instance by giving public funds straight to schools and letting schools buy the teachers and books they need. But teacher unions, which are politically powerful in many countries, would tend to oppose any such reform. So the best that can be done is often to manage prices centrally through skillful negotiation informed by good analysis. What is the problem if prices are too high? Well, if this happens, government's ability to expand education to more people is limited, and hence the whole human capital accumulation process is slowed down. Information asymmetries are a big problem in education systems. Information asymmetries come about when one party in a relationship knows much less than it should. In the relationship between the education system and households are at a serious disadvantage. Parents often do not understand what happens in their school. If their child attends class every day, they believe their child is learning to read and do her sums correctly. But as all of us involved in education know, this is too often not the case. What's the solution? Economists would say accountability systems, whereby schools give more regular and accurate information through things such as report cards and qualifications to parents. How might this help? Well, there's evidence indicating that the right signals to parents, combined with arrangements whereby parents can participate in the decision making of the school, can lead to better managed schools and hence better learning and teaching. But information asymmetries between the education system and households are not the only information asymmetries policymakers need to worry about. Administrators within the education system are often not fully aware of what happens in the education process. School principals have difficulty finding out what happens in the classroom, and the administration has difficulty establishing what exactly happens in schools. Well-designed testing systems that provide accurate information are increasingly being seen as essential for better education service delivery. At the post-school or university level, the quality of education is often measured in terms of what the education is worth in the labor market. Here, the information asymmetry problem is that students and their households do not have good information on what happens to graduates who go out and seek work. There's a limit to how much one can learn from one's neighbors and colleagues. Some countries have tackled this information asymmetry problem by gathering information on what happens to students after their studies and making this information easily accessible to the public. For instance, in Chile, you can go to a website, select an institution and a field of study, and then see what the average unemployment rate and income is of past students a year after leaving the institution. But dealing with information asymmetries is generally not enough. One needs to use the information produced by accountability systems to take action, affirmative or punitive, to maintain high education standards. This is a rather complex matter at the primary and secondary levels because one is dealing with a large system with many institutions and, of course, strong teacher unions, unless one is in a non-democratic country like China. Options that seem to work well are reward programs that reward all teachers in a school where test results improve over time. What's essential is that the administration should take action, first supportive and then disciplinary, where teachers, school principals, or administrators clearly break rules or fail to show commitment to education. We're all familiar with entrance tests and entrance requirements. In most countries, you need to have achieved some qualification before you enter a university. In some developing countries, students without sufficient levels of achievement cannot enter secondary schooling. In terms of the human capital model, we could say that these quality hurdles are about the government preventing bad investments. Households aren't allowed to make certain investments that are considered dead ends. For instance, investing in a medical training when a student has not mastered basic biology and mathematics. Of course, it would also be a bad investment for society as a whole to let students pursue studies they are unlikely to succeed in. There we have it then, the human capital model with some education policy issues added in. Remember, the basic human capital model is about how households decide to invest in education, how one understands the rates of return or the income benefits of investing in education whilst taking into account the costs. It's also about identifying human capital, and as we saw, human capital is about the things people know and can do. And the model is about how human capital translates into income for individuals and for the country as a whole. Thank you. We've reached the end of this talking slideshow on the human capital model.